Hi everyone, Emily Teacher here, and today we're reading A Poet of the People. Maya Angelou was honored by William Jefferson Clinton when he invited her to read a poem she had written to celebrate his inauguration as the 42nd President of the United States. This was a fitting tribute to the woman whose early life had seemed so empty of promise when she was born Margaret Johnson in St. Louis, Missouri, 64 years before. She sums up that life concisely in the lines from one of her poems. Birthing is hard and dying is mean, and living's a trial in between. So we're learning all about Maya Angelou and about her life that led to her fame years later when she was able to be on that stage with President Clinton during his inauguration. So let's learn more about her childhood and what led to who she became. When she was still a small child, her parents divorced. She and her older brother Bailey were raised by their grandmother, Annie Henderson, affectionately known as Mama. Mrs. Henderson was the proprietor of the only general store in Stamps, Arkansas, owned by an African American. In her first book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, Angelou evokes Mama's powerful presence as she lovingly describes the way her grandmother coped with the bigotry and racial hatred that was widespread in the country in the 1930s. It was this resilience that most impressed Angelou and in which she herself tried to emulate throughout her life. So when Maya Angelou was just a child, her parents divorced, so her and her brother were raised by their grandmother. But they didn't call her by her regular name or even grandma, but by the pseudonym Mama, which replaced her name. Mama, or Mrs. Henderson, she was the owner of the only general store in this town that was owned by an African American. So, in order to be a respected store owner in that time as an African American, Mrs. Henderson would have been a great businesswoman. She would have really had to know what she was doing. So she was a very strong woman that Maya Angelou later wrote about and tried to become like. One example of such bigotry involved a visit to the dentist. Angelou was suffering from an excruciating toothache. Mama had no choice but to take her granddaughter to the town's only dentist, who was white. When she asked him to treat the little girl's toothache, he rebuffed her, using extremely demeaning language. He told her that he would rather put his hand in a dog's mouth than to treat a black person. Mama reminded him that she had helped him in the past by making him interest-free loans. Now she was asking a favor in return. But he brusquely asserted that his debts had been paid. He ordered her to leave. After taking her grandchild out of the office, Mama returned and stood her ground. She demanded that the dentist pay her a fair rate of interest on the loans she had made him. Finally, he handed over $10, a large sum in those days. Only then did she depart, her dignity intact. She traveled over 30 miles with her granddaughter to Texarkana, where the nearest African American dentist practiced. So in this time in the 1930s, especially in Arkansas, there was a lot of racism and bigotry. African Americans were treated very, very badly by white people at that time in this location, especially. So when Maya had to go to the dentist, her grandmother tried to take her, right? But there was only one dentist in the town, and he was a white man. So when she asked for help, he just said some really terrible things to her, right? Really demeaning things that you would only say to things, not to people, right? So he treated them very badly and said he was not going to help Maya, even though Mama, right, or Mrs. Henderson had helped him out in the past. So she left and then decided to return. Right? So she came back and demanded that if he wasn't going to help, then he needed to pay her the interest on the loan that she had given him. So finally, he gave her the money so she was able to leave in a dignified way. So then she ended up taking Maya to 30 miles away to another place where there was an African-American dentist. When Angelou was 8 years old, she and her brother went to live with their mother in St. Louis. There, her mother's boyfriend abused her. He threatened to harm Bailey if she told anyone. When Angelou became ill, her mother discovered the despicable abuse. The boyfriend was brought to trial and convicted, but the shock of the experience left Angelou unable to speak for several years. So at 8, they left Mama and they went to their real mother's house in St. Louis to live, her and her brother. But their mother had a boyfriend who abused Maya, treated her very, very badly. And he threatened her, right, to hurt her brother if she told anyone. So she stayed quiet, but then later became sick, and they found out about all the abuse that had been happening. So the boyfriend of the mother, thankfully, was convicted, brought to jail. But it was so traumatic that Maya Angelou was not able to speak for years after that because of all that she experienced. In spite of her troubled and turbulent childhood, a spirit of optimism pervades I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. In it, Angelou pays tribute to those who helped and encouraged her. Among them was a neighbor named Bertha Flowers. She gave Angelou books and introduced her to the pleasures of reading poetry, drama, and great novels. As a result of Flowers' influence, Angelou became an avid reader. This led later to her dream of becoming a writer. 4 more volumes of autobiography and many collections of poetry followed I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. All appeared under her pseudonym, Maya Angelou, a name she began using in the 1950s. So during this time, later on, there was a nice neighbor, Bertha Flowers, who met Angelou, and she encouraged her and taught her about reading poetry, about drama, great novels. So then Maya Angelou became an avid reader. She loved to read, and she dreamed of becoming a writer, which we know that she did. And when she became a writer, she changed from her original name to her pseudonym, Maya Angelou, which we know her by now. And that was starting, she used that as her name starting in 1950s for her writing. It was a long and difficult road that she traveled, but it led to the presidential platform where she read her poem On the Pulse of Morning to an audience of millions on that cold January day. Angelou had triumphed over many difficulties, strengthened by the deep faith expressed in these lines from the poem. Lift up your hearts, each new hour holds new chances for a new beginning. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2014. A year later, the U.S. Postal Service issued a special Maya Angelou stamp to honor her memory. So she became a great writer, and she read this famous poem on that presidential platform to an audience of millions of people. So even though she struggled a lot, she stayed optimistic. She had help from others, and she lived a great life. Thank you for reading with me today. We do have links related to each of these articles. If you want the link for this one here, you can find it down in the description below.